And maybe before we dive into the presentation, maybe just to give a quick plug, I think there are probably some folks joining this call who are not SGP members or who are not Breaking Binary Circle members. So I just want to, give a plug for the SGP and in particular this circle. This is a really great professional space, and I really recommend looking into joining SGP. Just my little soapbox. So with that, we can get started with the presentation. Today, the topic is called Breaking the Binary in Engaging Men and Boys to Transforming Masculinities and Advancing Gender Equality. Maybe actually should we have our introductions first and then we can go backwards. I realize this is maybe a little weird the way I put it together. So my name is Emma Edwards. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I have over 9 years of experience working in gender equality in an international context. And I've been a Breaking Binaries member for around over 2 years. Over to you, Laxman, to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Laxman. I'm originally from Nepal, but we are based in DC as well. I've been in this field for about 15 and over years, doing gender mainstreaming to programming to advocacy to strategy building and so on. And I'm an advisory council member since this year. And yeah, specialize more around how do we really work with boys and men. And I work for a network called Men Engage Global Alliance. Back to you, Emma.
Thanks so much, Laxman. So we have a poll to kind of kick us off today. We understand that people have varied experiences with whether or not they've already worked on programs that engage men and boys, or if this is something totally new to you. We just kind of wanted to get a sense of where people are in that journey and if they've worked on these kinds of programs before. So if you can go to the Menti poll, and I will switch my screen. There's also a QR code here, so I'll leave that up for a second in case anyone needs a QR code. And then I will go to this screen. Can you see the Menti poll now? The Menti poll results on my screen?
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Awesome. So it looks like quite a few of the folks joining today have worked on this topic before, but also quite a few of the folks joining today have not worked on programs that address engaging men and boys yet. So I hope this discussion will be enlightening both for those who have worked on these programs. Maybe it can help you with new ideas for how you can integrate a more gender expansive lens into these programs. Or if you haven't worked on these programs before, maybe it can kind of give you new ideas for if you wanted to start working on these programs, how you could design them from the start with a gender expansive view and not in a way that perpetuates a gender binary. So great. Thanks so much, everyone, for participating in that. And just to give a quick overview of the topic, engaging men and boys, we wanted to share some background information on this field and on this practice in particular. Maybe Laxman, I think you had these points maybe on the more historical context. Can I hand it over to you to present that? And then I can start from the right side of the slide.
Sure. Yeah, and I mean, some of you might already be aware of this, is that the whole, what we now call as men and masculinities field, it's quite old in terms of particularly looking at the academic area with back then in the 70s in the US and Australia with the establishment of men and masculinities studies. There and back and forth of whether or not should men and masculinities be standalone studies or not. But then it still exists, but also in the international development sector, early 90s is when all of these programmatic and interventions got started, particularly with, it got really ignited after the ICPD call for programs of development in 1994. And then also following the Beijing World Conference, that was when really the two international conventions or commitments were publicly committed by some of the governments, supported by the governments, to really look into calling for boys and men to look into our roles and responsibilities when it comes to gender equality, LGBTIQ rights, climate justice, and social justice, but particularly starting from the generic violence against women world, and then in SRHR, which is sexual and reproductive health and rights. Over to you, Emma.
Sure, thanks, Laxman. So since the 1995 Fourth World Conference on Women that happened in Beijing, there was a specific focus on engaging men as agents of change for gender equality within kind of the declaration that came out of that conference. So since then, it's been continually emerging as a really important and critical approach for working towards gender equality, particularly within the feminist discourse. And the reasons for this, there are many reasons why this is such an important and I'll say effective approach for working towards gender equality. But here are just some of the reasons. Men are often seen as kind of gatekeeping gender equality or part of the problem. As Laxman was mentioning, it calls on men to kind of critically self-examine their own role in perpetuating gender inequalities and particularly in violence against women and girls. Men generally, this is a generalization, generally men have greater access to power as compared to women. All of our identities are intersectional, so it's not that all men have greater access to power than women, but because of their gender identity, this access to power can be impactful for having them influence decisions which affect gender equality. And then thirdly, if we so much traditional gender programming focuses only on women, which is 50% of the population in general. And I personally believe we will never achieve holistic change if we're only working with half of the population. That's never historically really contributed to a major shift. So working with broader swaths of the population by also bringing men and boys into the fold will help achieve change more easily. And finally, everyone, including men and boys, benefits from increased gender equality. There have been all sorts of studies showing that societies that have greater levels of gender equality, people are happier, more prosperous, etc. There are so many benefits, it would be hard to enumerate all of them. Laxman, over to you for this slide.
Having that said, though, but I think one confusion that always we stumble upon is what is this engaging boys and men all about, no? And sometimes we tend to just plug in this phrase called working with boys and men or engaging boys and men. But I think most of the time it gets conflated with whether this is an end goal on in itself or not, right? And we have now come to a realization that the engaging boys and men or working with boys and men is not an end goal. That is supposed to be our strategy out of many, again, is to achieve something else, right? As there is a particular goal that we want to head towards with this engagement of men, which is to do with women, advancing women's rights or gender justice or social justice, as we call it. And that to be very transformative, that is what the Beijing platform for call for action is all about, is that engagement needs to be really, really helping in transforming the stereotypical roles and gender expectations or the socialization of men, which we call as problematizing gender among men, and that helping men to understand that men are also gendered beings, being socialized to believe in a particular way or behave in a particular way that have implications not only disproportionately on the women and girls, but also on their own lives as well. So that's why it's not a zero-sum game. However, this work needs to be really, really feminist informed. It cannot just be men coming together to see what they want to do, but that being embedded within the broader feminist agenda for equality. And again, within that is sometimes when we talk about gender equality, as we all know, we tend to quickly go on a very gendered binary way of language or understanding. And that this work with boys and men sometimes or transforming masculinities get clinged to the male body, which is a typical way that state functions in terms of adhering or attaching certain norms to certain bodies and then determining how the bodies are going to be operating, right? And we kind of fall into this very gendered binary notions, and this LGBTIQ rights often gets left behind or left in the gap. So I think it is really important to make this very, very super clear from the beginning of what we mean by gender and social justice to be inclusive of LGBTIQ rights as well. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you, Laxman. Yeah, and going off of that, in our work, Laxman and I's work, we have experienced that many of these programs can perpetuate the idea of the false gender binary in some ways. And when I say the false gender binary, I'm referring to the notion that gender is just men and women on this binary. And obviously that is not what our experience has been and what we believe to be true. We see gender as more of a spectrum, amoeba. There are all sorts of different ways of thinking about how we construe gender identity. So there's often capacity building programs associated with the programs for engaging men and boys. And there are ways, big and small, which sometimes these programs are not designed to be inclusive of non-binary and trans people. The language, the discourse, and the conversations in capacity strengthening programs, as well as around the field of engaging men and boys, sometimes can reinforce this binary way of thinking of gender. And then lastly, it is sometimes not integrated into programs and organizational cultures, which means that this way of thinking about gender is not as effective, also doesn't have accountability mechanisms, and cannot adequately transform gender norms. Anything else you want to add on this slide, Laxman?
No, only one point is towards the last point. I think, this work is all about transforming the institutional culture as much as we are focusing so much of individual behavior change, right? Most of the programs so much are ingrained within the individual behavior change. Oh, we are then changing these poor people, right? Helping them to be gender just. I think it's also more so about integrating these principles in the work we do, through which we don't reinforce the same patriarchy that we are trying to create by putting men into pedestal again, right? So that engagement of men needs to be done in a very critical way.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the next part of our presentation, we wanted to share some common design elements of these programs for engaging men and boys that may be considered problematic in some way or may reinforce this idea of the false gender binary. And we're sharing these not to shame anyone. These are examples from our own work. So we're definitely not trying to shame anyone if these examples have also appeared or similar examples have also appeared in your own work. But rather, our goal today is for us together to critically examine some of these design elements of these programs and how they may reinforce this binary, how they may not be inclusive and welcoming to trans and non-binary people, and how we can kind of tweak some of these elements or shift our language when we are working on these kind of programs or this kind of work to be more inclusive and actually get at that point of transforming gender norms and thinking past the binary and helping others think past the binary as well. So we'll take a look at some of these elements together. And then these are, as I said, elements we've seen in our own work. And then we'll ask you if you have other examples. I'm sure there are other examples of ways you've seen in your own work that this kind of binary way of thinking of gender can be reinforced. So first is during the process of developing kind of a training or capacity strengthening initiative that engages men and boys, there is often, and this isn't the case 100% of the time, but often a process where you kind of co-develop the content or the training with local partners. And there is a process where you identify kind of no-go topics from the start. And I would say in like 9 out of 10 cases, the partner specifically asks you not to mention LGBTQI plus inclusion, not to even bring it up. So this kind of already from the start is a hindrance to, you know, how far you can go. But what is challenging is that I often find that participants actually are interested in learning about LGBTQI plus inclusion. And then they ask questions about it, but the facilitators haven't necessarily been prepared to respond to those questions because they were told not to address it. So it kind of creates a tricky situation. Anything you wanted to add on this slide, Laxman?
No, I think, while we do try to maintain this feminist principle of co-developing, and sometimes we as NGO workers or program builders or developers also play a kind of a gatekeeping role when it comes to inclusion of LGBTIQ, or not reinforcing gender binary in terms of programming or the language and so on, because of a certain fear. And I think, which is a legitimate fear, we would say, but then there are ways to go beyond and address some of those fear, because at the participants level, as Emma was saying, there is such a need for better understanding of their own experiences around gender identities, which do not really match to what the stereotypes are all about. And hence there is a interest to really understand in full terms who we are as human beings.
Yeah, absolutely. A second common activity that both Laxman and I have used in our work is called the man or the woman box, which kind of like literally puts people into boxes. So we have on the left side an example of a woman box where you have participants write inside the box kind of the stereotypical traits that are associated in that country or that society with being a woman. And then on the outside of the box, they write what is not associated with being a woman. So this is written in French, apologies, but basically on the inside of the box, it says, you know, household tasks, good behavior, engagement, discipline, responsibility, teaching children, familial support, etc. I think you get the picture. And then on the man box, it says, you know, physical tasks related to physical effort, to confront dangers, protect family, etc. So this exercise is useful in that it can help people start to think about what are the traits that are commonly like expected of me as a man or a woman, and how that is all made up, like how we can get like out of our boxes and how it's just a social construct. However, when you think about like how we're putting people into boxes and the way this looks versus like this is a visual that I love from the Trevor Project, which shows like one view of what gender identity might look like. This kind of amorphous blob where the, you know, you can be more towards one part of the blob, one more towards one part of the blob, kind of all over the place. It's just a very different view of gender. And I think this can risk, if there's not, you know, the proper language and debrief around this kind of box exercise, I think this can risk making people feel not included, and it centers kind of a cisgender heteronormative experience of gender.
Mm-hmm. And
anything you wanted to add? Yeah,
with that exercise, what I've started doing also is it's okay to start with these two boxes, right? But then you will figure out that there will be things that they will, community people or the population we work will add, which may not even fit into the boxes, or it's same on both boxes. And I think that's a great way to challenge the binary understanding in this exercise as well. And what I end up doing all the time nowadays with my students in the class or in the workshops I do is end with erasing the lines around the boxes, so that to kind of bring in the fluidity that exists within the way things have been conceptualized because of the way we are brought up and what we are supposed to be believing. But I think it's so fascinating to do that exercise with the community members, to really help them realize that I think within the boxes as well, they don't, no one in the group really fits into these boxes in a neat way. There will be overlaps for sure, and hence an importance of erasing the boxes. And I kind of put that as part of a spectrum, and that helps to begin with challenging, the gender binary understanding from there and on in itself. That can actually we be well informing the rest of the workshops or programs as well.
Thank you, Laxman. Next, we have seen exercises that focus on kind of gender segregated discussions, whether it be through, there's a common exercise called the gender fishbowl, where you have men sit in the center, women sit on the outside, and you ask the men certain questions and the women are supposed to listen, and then they switch. So for someone who is trans or non-binary, this can obviously bring up questions. Which group do I sit with? Are my experiences of gender also valid within this discussion, within this group? So I think this can also be a slightly, problematic, non-inclusive design. But it is also recognizing that it is also very important for advancing gender equality to have those kind of spaces where women and men feel that they can share safely their experiences of gender and gender equality. So yeah, anything you want to add here, Laxman?
No, I think, only one point I would add is in this exercise, I think it's sometimes helpful to go for the third round as well, to see if anyone who didn't find or didn't felt were associated, or their stories were associating with what has been shared, so that we can also come up a little more inclusive in the space itself. And also, I think one thing to really clear out from the very beginning, as we always do, and probably you already do that, is to clarify that even though we call it gender fishbowl, it's about listening to experiences of people of different identities. So it's about embedding accountability and inclusivity from the very beginning, and the acceptance, which is again a big piece in the picture, that we clarify it is about accepting and listening without any biases in mind to begin with. So it's about experiential learning in that process, so that it feels a little more. But these are, again, some of the learnings by experiences that we have been doing. No? So there could be other ideas that we want to hear from you later as well on what you may have done in your own work.
Thanks. And then the last example we have, and I think this has been discussed at length in our circle group, but it's always important to raise, is just non-inclusive methods of data collection. We are not sufficiently collecting data about trans and non-binary identities who may be participating in this training, and that contributes to a self kind of reinforcing cycle where the funder or the program designer or whoever might say, oh, well, we don't have people who identify that way, so we don't need to kind of incorporate this lens. But of course, we don't have the data to show that we either do or don't have anyone who identifies outside of the gender binary. So this is just an overall issue, I think, in the sector that we've discussed, but yeah.
Yeah. And that also has to do with the context we are exercising, right? And what we are doing with this data. In the context right now, for example, Uganda just comes to the top of my head, is that if we use or showcase this data to the government level, that data is going to be doing more harm, right? So I think it also depends on our own sensitivity on clarifying what are we going to be doing with this data, segregated data collection, and make sure that there isn't safe space for people to really identify who they are, so that they don't feel threatened or potentially having threatened after the workshop. So I think that needs to be clarified, and that might help to be a little more nuanced in relation to what data we are collecting. But yeah, we need to keep in mind the safeguarding aspect as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That is such an important point, that this, if we did want to be more inclusive with our data collection, we'd have to really check with local populations about what the safety context is, what are good practices to follow for collecting that data and protecting it, and making sure that the act of, somewhat selfish act of wanting better data doesn't cause harm for others. We do have some discussion questions we want to get to, but before the discussion questions, just wondering if anyone else on the call in your own work on engaging men and boys for gender equality have seen other examples of kind of activities or discussions, language use that could potentially reinforce this idea of the false gender binary. To our discussion. So our first discussion question, and I have them all up on the screen, so I guess, feel free to respond to any of the questions that that speak to you. But our first discussion question is, what are some of the barriers that non-binary and trans individuals face in participating in gender equality programs that focus on engaging men? And I kind of already touched on this a little bit, but would love to hear your perspectives as well about what you see might be the barriers.